Hey everyone, Father Lane here. Welcome to another class in our course on the Pentateuch, and today you can see we have come to Waffle House for our discussion on the book of Leviticus. It's appropriate because the book of Leviticus actually spends a good bit of time talking about food, and for whatever reason, as I was thinking about the Levitical sacrifices, it made me want to go to Waffle House, so we're going to sit here at Waffle House and talk about Leviticus. Let's look at our agenda for today. We're going to first look at why Leviticus is important. Indeed, the book of Leviticus is famous for being the death knell of many a New Year's resolution to read the whole Bible in a year. People find the book boring. Let's talk about why it's not boring. Then we're going to do an outline of the book, and then we're going to talk about the most enduring section of Leviticus, the Holiness Code, a code of laws, the second of our 3 legal codes in the Pentateuch, and then we'll say a few brief words about the theology of the book of Leviticus. But before we go any further, let's consider that name Leviticus. It's been the name of this book ever since the Greek Septuagint, and it sounds like it's a book just about Levites. But is that true? Let's look at the first verse of the book. The Lord called Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting. Speak to the Israelites and tell them, when any one of you brings an offering of livestock to the Lord, you shall bring your offering from the herd or from the flock. Notice that this is a book about all of Israel. It describes how Israel is going to remain in right relationship with the Lord. Most of the laws are applicable generally to all of Israel, not just Levites. Moreover, it's going to describe more fundamentally how Israel can be God's holy people. That is, a people set apart from all the other nations on earth. Let's go ahead and look now at how Leviticus functions within the whole Pentateuch and how it's structured internally. You'll remember this slide from our classes on Exodus. This is the outline of everything from Exodus all the way through Deuteronomy. What we're seeing here in Leviticus is entirely set at the tabernacle. We're still on Mount Sinai, and we're going to stay there all the way into the first 2 chapters of the book of Numbers. This is the centerpiece note of the entire Pentateuch, which tells you something about how Israel understood this book's importance. It's the centerpiece. It's in the place of honor. It articulates what is so special about Israel. So now let's look at the book internally. You can see that the first 5 chapters deal with different kinds of sacrifices and offerings, and indeed there's further ritual instructions in chapters 6 and 7. Chapters 8 through 10 are narrative about the ordination of priests and the serious business that priestly ministry is. Indeed, bad things happen when foul incense is offered to the Lord in the sanctuary, but that's another story for another day. Chapters 11 through 15 deal with the distinction between clean and unclean. It's going to be true of animals, and indeed what foods may Israel eat and not eat, as well as what should Israel do when bodily diseases start to run amok, especially how should Israel deal with skin disorders or other contagions that could infect the community. A timely topic now that we're living in the COVID pandemic. Then in chapter 16, the topic turns to the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. The ritual for that is here in chapter 16. Then we'll get to the Holiness Code, which we're going to deal with in greater detail in just a moment. And then the book concludes with instructions on things and persons dedicated to the Lord. First, I want us to look at chapters 1 through 5. You can see on your screen here the 5 main kinds of offerings detailed in these opening chapters. And I want you to notice that they're going to recur in the Bible. These are important. The whole burnt offering is an animal, and you can see there's 5 choices there. Only males may be offered as a whole burnt offering. That is entirely burnt up to the Lord. No part of it is eaten by the priest or the people. It differs when you get to the grain offering or the well-being / communion / peace offering. They get translated differently by different translators, in which only part of the sacrifice is burned up to the Lord. Other parts of it are eaten either by the priest and indeed in some cases even by the people. Also in chapters 4 and 5 we deal with the related purification and reparation offerings. These deal with what Israel should do when someone unintentionally breaches the law. There still is some order that has to be reachieved even after what later moral theology would call invincible ignorance. A lot of times people ask, why were these foods clean and these other foods unclean? And indeed, the reason seems to be that when an animal doesn't obey the neat, orderly prescriptions, if an animal has physical features that seem to be a compromise between a water-dwelling creature versus a land-dwelling creature, that animal is considered to be unclean as they violate order. Whatever the rationale is, it had two purposes. One likely was to maintain hygiene in a society where, of course, modern health did not exist, but also it emphasized the holiness of God's people. You'll notice in the quote, the second quote on your screen here, the one commonality among the laws now is that they are gathered under the rubrics of God's will for Israel. Hence, these statutes are put forth because they have the best interests of the community at heart. So notice here the unity between Israel's relationship with God and Israel's relationship with one another. These two things, love of God and love of neighbor, are going to show up consistently throughout both testaments of the Bible. Let's move forward now to the Holiness Code, this most important part of Leviticus, and I want to begin by emphasizing why it's called the Holiness Code. You can see on your screen here, this is Leviticus 19. Speak to the whole Israelite community and tell them, be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. Israel is called to be holy, and remember again, holy, that is kadosh in Hebrew. That which is kadosh, that which is holy, is that which is set apart from ordinariness, from ordinary, profane existence. Israel's identity is that they have been chosen by God and set apart. God has led them out of Egypt. They have been let out of slavery of Pharaoh so that they can serve the Lord. That is what it means for them to be a holy people. We even saw echoes of that back in Exodus chapter 19. As we look at the Holiness Code, you can see the structure here, and it covers a wide range of legal issues. We don't have time to go through all of them here, but I do want to look at a couple. Let's look first at Leviticus 17:7. Here we have an instruction about how animals are to be slaughtered, and they're to be slaughtered at the meeting tent. They're to be slaughtered before the Lord. And notice what it says here. No longer shall they offer their sacrifices to the demons with whom they prostituted themselves. Scholars often think that this is a tip-off that these commands are being either reordered or restructured around either the exilic period. Some would even argue a little bit earlier. Some would argue for a pre-exilic date now of the Holiness Code, because we see an affinity with this in the book of Jeremiah and in some of the other prophetic books, that Israel prostitutes themselves with foreign gods. Let's also look at this law. We are in Leviticus 19, verse 18. This is the most important passage, at least according to the New Testament, from Leviticus. We read, "Take no revenge and cherish no grudge against your own people. You shall love your neighbor as yourself." I would be willing to make a wager, if I were a betting man, and I am not, I would be willing to bet that if we were to do a poll around Christians all around the world and ask them who first said, love your neighbor as yourself, most people, including many clergy, would incorrectly say that it was Jesus. It is not. It is right here in Leviticus. This verse is quoted 6 different times in the New Testament. So this is interesting because many of the laws given in Leviticus, and Paul's going to be explicit about this in his letters, don't apply anymore, especially the food laws, the dietary laws. They don't apply anymore. Yet, this law in Leviticus holds firm, and not only does it hold firm, notice the context here. You shall cherish no grudge against your own people. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. That question that the lawyer asked Jesus before he told the parable of the Good Samaritan, and who is my neighbor, was not a stupid question. It was a legitimate question. Neighbor seems to have a narrow meaning right here. However, in the New Testament, it's going to be interpreted very broadly, especially as the Gentiles are brought in to the blessings of Israel according to St. Paul in Romans chapters 9 through 11. So save that for studying the New Testament as well. Let's talk a little bit more broadly about the Holiness Code. The prophets would critique Israel's sacrificial system, all of which is detailed in the opening chapters of Leviticus, for fostering hypocrisy in Israel. But the Holiness Code reminds the people who they're called to be. It shows a more positive view of priesthood and the value of sacrifices. And this brings us to a discussion of the theology of Leviticus. As we learned earlier in the course, Wellhausen, when he detailed his four-source theory, considered the priestly source the most recent and thus the worst of the 4 sources. It ultimately is trying to articulate how a good God would have a relationship with his people and how the people can share in God's own holiness. It really is quite profound, and it's something that's going to be revisited again in the New Testament when St. Paul, among other authors, are telling us how we are also called to be sanctified. Until next time, read well and pray well.